After the war ended, Germany tried to forget, but not everyone could. In 1948, in a small Bavarian village still heavy with rubble and grief, 3 orphaned children were found living in a house without parents, clean, quiet, polite, too polite. The neighbors said they were good children. They said they helped with chores, prayed at night, never caused trouble. Then the animals began to disappear, then a child, then the doctor who tried to help. When the authorities finally opened the cellar, what they found didn't look like madness or hunger. It looked like something carefully practiced, something learned. The report was burned a year later. The house was demolished, and the village swore the same thing. They weren't evil. They were what was left. Before we open this file from 1948 Bavaria, before we learn what those children did and why no one stopped them, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record. Every day we uncover stories history tried to bury, tales of silence, survival, and what happens when humanity looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize its own reflection. Now, let's go back to a village that thought the war was over, until 3 children reminded them it never really ended. The war had ended 3 years earlier, but Bavaria hadn't noticed. In 1948, the hills still held the smell of smoke and iron, and every town looked like a half-healed wound. The village of Grunwald sat quietly between 2 valleys, its church roof gone, its people older than their faces. They spoke softly, as if the air itself might still be listening for bombs. No one talked about the past, not the men who'd come back from camps or the women who hadn't. They buried their stories under work, tilling grey soil that refused to grow much, mending walls that would never quite stand straight again. There was a sort of peace in that silence, a desperate, fragile peace. At the far edge of the village stood a house that no one claimed. The roof sagged like a broken shoulder, but smoke rose from its chimney every evening. People said 3 children lived there, a brother and 2 sisters. No one knew their last name anymore. Some said Baumann, others said Kraus. It didn't matter. They were simply the orphans. The villagers left food at the gate, a loaf of bread, sometimes potatoes, sometimes nothing. The next morning, it was always gone. No one ever saw who took it. The first time anyone saw the children was a Sunday in late March. The church bell had only half a tongue left, so it rang dull and uneven, echoing across the snowmelt fields. The children appeared at the back pew, clean, quiet, their faces pale but calm. The eldest girl wore a grey dress too big for her. The boy held his sister's hand. They bowed when spoken to. They said please, thank you, and God bless you in perfect, practiced rhythm. Their politeness made the villagers uncomfortable. After Mass, the baker's wife whispered to the priest, "Who takes care of them?" The priest shrugged. "They take care of themselves." He'd tried to visit once, weeks earlier, but said the door never opened. "They must be afraid," he told the council. "Children learn fear faster than faith." Still, no one tried again. In Grunwald, everyone understood that some doors stayed closed for a reason. As spring thawed into mud, strange things began to happen. Chickens vanished. A farmer's goat was found dead, neatly arranged beside the fence, its eyes closed like someone had prayed over it. No one spoke of it openly, but people started locking their sheds and keeping their lamps burning later into the night. One evening, as the sun bled red across the fields, the blacksmith swore he saw movement near the old house, a figure at the window standing perfectly still, watching the village. When he blinked, it was gone. By then, no one called them orphans anymore. They called them angels, because only angels could stay untouched by a world so dirty with sin, and only angels perhaps could survive it. The children became part of the village the way a stain becomes part of fabric, noticed, unspoken, never removed. Anna, the eldest, always spoke for them. She carried herself like a grown woman, her back straight, her tone careful. When the butcher offered her scraps, she'd curtsy and say, "We already have enough, thank you." He'd glance at her arms, thin as broom handles, and say nothing more. Emil, the middle one, was smaller for his age, but strong. He repaired things no one showed him how to fix: clocks, radios, lanterns. When the priest's watch broke, Emil returned it the next morning, ticking perfectly, though the priest never remembered giving it to him. And Lena, the youngest, didn't speak much at all. She hummed. always the same soft tune under her breath, like she was remembering a lullaby no one had taught her. No one saw them fight. No one saw them play. They never seemed cold, though their clothes were too thin for the weather. Anna's hair was always brushed, Emil's hands always clean. They came to church every Sunday, sitting in the same back pew, listening with faces as still as porcelain. People pitied them at first. War children, they said. Poor things. But pity is a short-lived kindness. After a while, pity turns to suspicion, especially when something doesn't feel right. The baker's wife swore she saw the 3 children walking through the cemetery at night, barefoot, carrying a lantern. The next morning, the flowers on the war memorial had been rearranged. Every white lily gone, every red carnation laid in perfect lines across the graves of soldiers. The old tailor said they never cast shadows when they passed by his shop. The carpenter said he'd seen them talking to no one, heads tilted like they were listening to someone behind them. But when anyone asked, Anna would smile and say, "We have each other, that's enough." It wasn't just her voice. It was her eyes. Calm, level, older than they should have been. There was something in them that unsettled even the priest. He tried to talk to them once after Mass, placing a hand on Anna's shoulder. "My child," he said gently, "do you pray?" Anna nodded. "Yes, Father." "And what do you pray for?" She smiled. "Patience." The priest hesitated. "Patience for what?" Her answer came without pause, like she'd practiced it. "For when they come back." He frowned. "Who?" Anna looked past him, toward the graveyard outside the church wall. "The ones who taught us," she said. That evening the priest walked home under a sky so grey it looked bruised. He didn't tell anyone what she said. He just rang the church bell twice that night, the old signal for prayer in times of fear. The next morning, the bakery door was found open, the cat gone, and footprints, 3 small, bare ones, in the flour by the counter. Dr. Konrad Weiss came to Grunwald the way outsiders always came to ruined towns, with polite purpose and quiet horror. He was 45, a medical examiner from Munich assigned to inspect post-war rural health conditions. His orders were bureaucratic: record cases of malnutrition, distribute penicillin, write reports no one would read. He had been a field surgeon during the war, though he never said which side he served. His hands still shook when he held a scalpel. When people asked, he said it was age, but he was only middle-aged. The mayor met him at the train stop with a handshake that smelled of tobacco and fear. "We've few cases left," he said quickly. "Mostly children. There are 3 in particular you might look at. The orphans near the river." Weiss frowned. "Are they sick?" The mayor's eyes darted away. "Not in the way you mean." The road to the orphan house wound through fields of thawed mud and ruined fences. Weiss noticed how quiet the land was. No birds, no dogs, just the wind. The house itself stood apart from the rest, leaning slightly to one side like something exhausted from waiting too long. He knocked. It was Anna who opened the door. Her expression was calm, polite. "You're the doctor," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Weiss replied. "I came to see how you're managing." She stepped aside. "We're fine." Inside, everything was neat to the point of discomfort. 3 small beds lined the wall, blankets folded exactly alike. Dishes were stacked clean, not chipped. On the table sat a half-empty bottle of milk, though Weiss saw no cow outside. Emil appeared from the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back. "Did you bring more?" he asked. "More what?" The boy smiled faintly. "Medicine." Weiss glanced at his satchel. "You don't need any." "Not for us," Emil said. "For the others." Lena sat in the corner, humming softly. She didn't look up. The sound threaded through the air, a lullaby without warmth, without melody. "Others?" Weiss asked. Anna answered for him. "The ones Father left for us to care for." Weiss tried to smile, though his throat felt dry. "Where is your father now?" "Gone," Anna said simply. "But he visits." It wasn't a child's voice that said it. It was something practiced, rehearsed, almost adult. Weiss examined them, Pale skin, thin frames, steady eyes. Malnourished, yes, but not weak. He wrote notes in his ledger as he spoke. No fever, no coughing, sufficient hygiene. Psychological flattening noted. When he looked up again, Emile was standing closer. "Will you teach us?" he asked. "Teach you what?" "How to make people better." Weiss hesitated. "That's a long lesson." Emile nodded solemnly. "We have time." The doctor packed his satchel quickly, but as he stepped outside, he realized the strange, sweet smell in the air wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the ground. Dr. Konrad Weiss returned to the orphan house 3 days later. He told himself it was professional curiosity, an incomplete medical file, a need for accuracy. But that was a lie. What brought him back was something simpler: unease. The kind that lingers beneath the skin like a fever you pretend isn't there. He arrived at dusk, the time when the village always seemed to hold its breath. The fields were quiet, and even the birds had stopped calling. The door opened before he could knock. Anna stood there, smiling faintly. "You came back?" "Yes," he said, "to check on you." "We're fine," she replied, "but you should come in." The house was spotless again, impossibly so. It smelled faintly of soap and iron. The children had set the table with chipped plates, 3 spoons, and an empty glass waiting in the 4th seat. Weiss assumed it was for him until he noticed the way the glass had fingerprints already smudged along the rim, small ones. Emile was sitting by the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate motions. Not violently, just precisely. The rasp of metal against stone was steady, rhythmic. "What are you doing?" Weiss asked. "Practicing," the boy said. "For what?" Emile smiled. "For when we help." Lena hummed quietly from the corner again, her voice blending with the scrape of steel. Weiss tried to focus on his notes, to remember his duty. He asked the usual questions. "Are you eating? Sleeping? Any pain?" The children nodded or shook their heads in perfect coordination, answering like soldiers repeating a catechism. Finally, Anna asked, "Do you help people like us?" "Children?" he asked. "No," she said softly. "Broken ones." He froze. "Who told you that word?" "Father," she said. "He said we were made to fix what others ruin." Weiss closed his ledger. "Your father's gone, Anna." Her expression didn't change. "So they say." He decided to leave then, but as he reached for his coat, Emile handed him something wrapped in cloth. "We made this for you," the boy said. Weiss unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small doll, crude, stitched from rags. Its chest was cut open, revealing a tiny pocket stuffed with straw. Someone had drawn a red circle where the heart should be. The doctor's mouth went dry. "What is this?" Emile looked proud. "It's the one you fix." Weiss put it down gently, forcing his voice calm. "I see. A toy?" "No," Anna said from behind him. "A lesson." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of smoke from the fields. Weiss stepped out quickly, promising to return with medicine he'd never bring. When he reached the road, he glanced back once. The house was dark now, but in the upstairs window he could see 3 small silhouettes, standing perfectly still, watching him leave. Dr. Weiss began writing about the children in his notebook the way he used to write about patients during the war, with distance, with precision, with that deliberate calm that keeps horror from becoming unbearable. He told himself this was for the ministry, but in truth, he was documenting them, not as a doctor, as a witness. April 14th, 1948, 3 siblings. Polite, unnaturally composed, speech elevated, behavioral imitation observed. He visited twice a week now, though he never admitted to anyone why. The villagers had stopped asking. They watched him walk the road to the orphan house with the same wary silence they'd given the children. Pity turned to quiet blame. Inside, things were always the same. Too clean, too quiet. Anna would greet him, thank him for coming, offer tea made from boiled herbs that left a bitter aftertaste. Lena would hum softly, always the same unending tune. And Emile, Emil would watch him with that still, clinical focus that made Weiss uneasy. The boy never asked childish questions, only technical ones. Why do you boil instruments? Does sleep make people heal faster? What happens to blood when it stops moving? Weiss tried to answer without sounding alarmed. He gave vague, gentle replies, but Emil remembered every word. Once, when Weiss described how muscles tighten during death, the boy simply nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. Then, small things began to go missing. First, it was a thermometer, then a scalpel, then a small jar of chloroform that Weiss had locked in his satchel. He assumed he'd misplaced them until he saw the drawing. He found it pinned to the wall near the children's beds. Pencil lines, faint but precise, a human hand, bones labelled in careful German script. The style was eerily similar to medical diagrams he'd seen in training, too perfect for a child. He took it down. "Where did you learn this?" Anna looked up from her sewing. "Father's books," she said. "There are no books here," she smiled. "There are, if you remember." He wanted to press her further, but then Lena began humming again. That same tune, too low to drown out, too steady to ignore. The sound filled the room like fog, dulling the edges of his thoughts. Weiss pocketed the drawing and left early that day, his pulse uneven. That night, he couldn't sleep. His dreams were fragmented. White rooms, a bright lamp, a voice whispering, "Be still." When he woke, his hands were shaking, and on his bedside table lay the missing scalpel, polished clean. He didn't remember bringing it home. By May, the village had gone quiet again, but not with peace. It was the stillness that comes before a storm you can't see yet. One by one, the animals began to vanish. It started with the chickens from the Reiner farm, then 2 goats, then the miller's dog. At first, people blamed wolves coming down from the hills, but wolves didn't fold blankets. They didn't leave the tools in neat piles beside the empty pens. The first person to say it out loud was the blacksmith's wife. "It's the children," she whispered over bread and beer. "The angels." No one wanted to believe her, but no one argued either. Weiss didn't hear the rumors until a week later. He was at the town council reviewing vaccination reports when someone mentioned the disappearances in passing. The mayor laughed uneasily. "Maybe the orphans are feeding their ghosts," he said, half as a joke, but no one smiled. That afternoon, Weiss went back to the house. He found Emil outside, kneeling in the dirt. The boy was digging with his bare hands, the soil already dark and wet. "Emil," Weiss said softly, "what are you doing?" The boy didn't stop. "Burying." "Burying what?" "Dinner," Emil said, and smiled faintly. Weiss stepped closer. The smell hit first, iron, rot, and something sweet, like fruit turned sour. He crouched and saw what the boy had been covering, feathers, blackened and slick, packed into the earth like offerings. Weiss's voice broke. "Why would you do this?" Emil looked up at him, calm. "They were loud. We made them quiet." Weiss straightened, his stomach twisting. He wanted to shout, to drag the boy by the arm, but something in Emil's expression stopped him. It wasn't cruelty. It was study. He was watching the doctor's reaction the way a student watches a lesson. "Where are your sisters?" Weiss asked. "In the cellar," Emil said. "Helping." The doctor turned toward the house, his hands shaking. The cellar door was closed, nailed shut again, though he remembered it being open on his last visit. He heard faint voices beneath the floorboards, whispering, then a giggle, then nothing. He forced his breath steady and knocked once on the door. "Anna?" No reply. He told himself it was imagination, that isolation was twisting his judgment, that trauma makes children strange. He walked back to the gate without looking behind him. But later, as he passed through the square, a farmer stopped him. "Doctor," the man said nervously, "you've seen those little ones. Tell me true. Are they right in the head?" Weiss tried to form an answer. What came out instead was the truth he couldn't name. "They're learning," he said quietly. "I just don't know what." That night, He burned his notes from the visit. But when he washed his hands afterward, the water turned pink. He didn't remember touching anything red. By June, word of the angelic orphans reached a woman named Frau Helene Scharf, the new schoolteacher assigned by the district office. She was young, strict, still believing that structure and discipline could mend what the war had broken. When she heard the children didn't attend school, she called it a civic shame. They must learn, she told the mayor. Books heal ignorance. The mayor only sighed. Not all ignorance, Frau Scharf. But she went anyway. She arrived at the old house with her lesson book and a satchel of chalk, her hair pinned neatly despite the heat. Anna greeted her at the door, polite as ever, her eyes calm and empty. "I've come to teach you," Helene said warmly. Anna stepped aside. "Then you'd better come in." Inside, the air was cooler, darker. The curtains were drawn, the walls too clean. Helene set her books down on the table and opened one. The children gathered without being told. Anna, Emil, Lena, sitting straight-backed, hands folded on their laps. "Do you know your letters?" she asked. Anna nodded. "All of them." "Then write for me." She handed Anna a piece of paper. The girl took the pencil and wrote in delicate, slanted script. "We remember what we must." Helene frowned. "That's not what I asked you to write." Anna looked up. "It's what you needed." Something about her tone made the teacher's throat tighten. She turned to Emil. "And you? What do you remember?" He smiled faintly. "Everything Father showed us." "What did he show you?" He hesitated, then whispered, "The inside of things." Helene blinked. "You mean anatomy?" "Yes," Emil said. "That's what he called it, making the world honest." Lena began humming again, that same soft, circular tune. It filled the room until Helene's skin prickled. She forced herself to smile. "We'll start with arithmetic, then." She drew on the blackboard. 2 plus 2. Lena stopped humming long enough to say, 4. "Good," Helene said, relieved. "And 3 plus 5. 8, Emil answered, though he wasn't looking at the board. He was watching her hands, her veins, the way they moved as she wrote. After an hour, Helene closed her book. The air in the house felt heavier now, thick with that faint iron scent. "We'll meet again tomorrow," she said quickly. Anna smiled. "If you come back." Helene didn't sleep that night. She dreamt of small hands pressing on her eyelids, whispering numbers in her ear until the sum became her name. The next morning she resigned her position by letter. She wrote only one line to the mayor. "They don't need to learn. They're only remembering." She left the village that same day. No one ever took her post again. Summer came late to Grunwald that year. The fields refused to grow, and the air stayed cold long after it should have softened. Dr. Weiss spent most of his days writing reports no one read, and his nights trying not to dream about the house by the river. But one evening, while walking home through the square, he saw something that made him stop. Anna was sitting alone on the church steps, her grey dress wet from the rain. A small book rested in her lap. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even shivering. She was just waiting. He approached slowly. "You'll catch cold out here," he said. She looked up, calm as always. "We don't catch things anymore." Weiss hesitated. "May I walk you home?" She nodded once, closing the book. They walked in silence. The sun had long disappeared, and the sky was a deep bruise of purple and ash. When they reached the gate, Anna turned to him. "Would you like to read something, Doctor?" He frowned. "Read what?" She held out the book. "It helps when you're afraid." Before he could answer, she slipped through the door and vanished inside, leaving him holding it. Weiss didn't open it until later that night. The handwriting was small and precise, not the messy scrawl of a child, but the measured script of someone copying rather than writing. April 3rd. Father said mercy is the shape of the knife. If you cut fast, it's love. April 10th. We practiced silence. We did not cry. April 18th. Emil learned where the warmth hides, under the ribs. We kept it for later. April 25th. Doctor visits. He doesn't know he's teaching again. Weiss froze at that last line. The next page was smeared with something dark, not ink. It smelled faintly metallic. Below the stains, one more line. Mother said to wait until he stops pretending. He shut the book, his pulse hammering. He wanted to throw it into the fire, but something stopped him, a grim, professional curiosity, the same instinct that had kept him alive during the war. He read until dawn. There were no drawings this time, no childish rhymes. Only cold, mechanical entries, written with the detached calm of a surgeon's log. Temperatures, times, subjects, failures marked with crosses. At the bottom of the final page, written in faint, uneven letters, was something different. Tomorrow we open the door again. He will see. Then he will remember. The ink trailed off there, the last line pressed deep into the paper, as if written by a trembling hand. Weiss closed the book carefully, wrapped it in cloth, and hid it under his coat. When he stepped outside, the morning fog was thick, clinging to the ground. The first thing he saw were footprints, 3 of them, leading from his doorstep back toward the river. Dr. Weiss went back to the house 2 days later. He told no one this time. The diary still sat in his coat pocket, its weight impossible to ignore. Every time he tried to convince himself it was a child's fantasy, that line came back to him. He will remember. The road to the river was silent. Even the air seemed unwilling to move. The house waited at the end, like it had been expecting him. The curtains were drawn, no smoke from the chimney, no sound. He knocked once. Anna opened the door almost immediately. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes flicked to the coat he wore, and Weiss knew she recognized what was hidden there. "You read it," she said. He nodded. "Yes. Then you know." He forced his voice to stay calm. "I know enough to ask where your mother is buried." Anna smiled faintly. "Buried." Before he could speak again, Emile appeared in the hallway, his hands behind his back. "She's not buried," he said. "She's waiting." Weiss stepped inside, the smell hitting him at once, damp wood, earth, and something else beneath it. Something sweet. "Show me," he said. Anna led him to the back room. The cellar door stood there, nailed shut with long, blackened spikes. He'd seen it before, but now it looked fresher, as though the wood had been replaced recently. "Why is this sealed?" he asked. Lena's voice came from behind him, soft as breath. "Because things come out if you let them." Weiss crouched beside the door. He could feel the cold seeping through the wood. He reached out to touch it, and Anna spoke sharply. "Don't." He froze. Emile's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "She doesn't like to be touched." Weiss stood slowly, heart pounding. "Your mother is dead, children." Anna tilted her head. "Then why does she speak?" Weiss turned to her, his patience unraveling. "Because you're remembering her. That's all." She stared at him, almost pitying. "No, Doctor, you're the one remembering." The room seemed smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Weiss swallowed hard. "Open this door," he said, voice shaking despite himself. Anna took a step back. "You wouldn't like what's left of her." He moved to the door, grabbed one of the nails and began to pull. It came loose with a groan, splintering the frame. The smell grew stronger, wet soil, rot, and something faintly chemical. When he pried the last board free, cold air rushed out like breath. The steps below disappeared into black. "Stay here," he ordered. Anna shook her head. "You first." He took one step down, then another. The wood creaked beneath his weight. From below came a sound, soft, wet, rhythmic. A sound he hadn't heard since the war. Suturing. He lifted the lantern and saw a table, small, wooden, covered in linen. On it lay something shaped like a person, but it was far too small to be whole. The lantern trembled in Dr. Weiss's hand. He stepped closer to the table, each footfall sinking slightly into the damp soil. The air down there was colder than outside, heavy with the smell of formalin and iron. The shape on the table wasn't a person, not anymore. It was a collection of things that once belonged to one. Bones, small and delicate, arranged as if someone had tried to rebuild a body from memory. He reached out, forcing his hand steady. The skin that remained was waxy, preserved. Threads of black hair clung to the scalp. But what froze him wasn't the remains themselves. It was the order of them. Each piece laid perfectly in place, each incision deliberate, like the work of a surgeon. The children stood at the top of the stairs, silent. Only the faint glow of the lantern reached their faces. Weiss swallowed hard. Who did this? Anna didn't hesitate. Father. He's dead, Weiss said. She nodded. But his lessons aren't. Emil descended 2 steps, calm as ever. He said perfection isn't about life or death, it's about control. Weiss's mind flashed to the old photos he'd seen of medical experiments during the war, rows of children, labelled and numbered, standing beside men in white coats. He remembered how many of those men had vanished after 1945, absorbed into the new world under new names. He looked again at the bones, the precision, the method, the familiarity. And suddenly he realized what was wrong with the cellar. There were no books, no tools, nothing an ordinary child could have used to learn this. The techniques were too exact. He knew them because they were his own. The stitches, the cuts, the way the ribs had been separated. He'd done them before, in field hospitals, when the screaming was constant and the blood wouldn't stop. He staggered back. Where did you learn this? Anna's eyes didn't waver. You taught us. Weiss's mouth went dry. That's impossible. Not if you were there, she said quietly. You were one of them. He shook his head, backing toward the stairs. No, I treated soldiers. Do you remember Leipzig? Anna interrupted. The word hit him like a knife. He did. A camp on the outskirts. Prisoners used for medical trials. He hadn't been one of the monsters. At least that's what he'd told himself. He'd followed orders. He'd survived. He'd forgotten. Until now. Anna took another step down. Her voice softened, almost kind. He said you'd come back when you were ready to remember. Weiss stumbled toward the stairs, nearly dropping the lantern. He could feel the air changing, the faint hum of Lena's tune above him, the rustle of movement in the dark corners of the cellar. He turned once before climbing out. The light flickered over the far wall. There, half buried in shadow, was a photograph pinned crookedly to the wood. It showed a man in uniform smiling beside 3 children. His own face. Sleep stopped being rest. It became a rehearsal. Dr. Weiss began dreaming in fragments, the flicker of lamps, the smell of alcohol and gauze, the sound of a child repeating his own words back to him in perfect rhythm. He'd wake drenched in sweat, his hands trembling as if he'd been holding a scalpel all night. The dreams were too clear, too exact, and what terrified him most was that they weren't foreign. They were familiar. One morning he woke with the taste of metal on his tongue and found a line of dried blood under his fingernails. He checked his apartment. Nothing disturbed. No sign of entry. But when he reached for his notebook, he saw a new entry in his own handwriting, one he didn't remember writing. They are following the pattern perfectly. The next day, Weiss avoided the house. He worked at the town clinic, examining children with rashes, tending to farmers' infections. He forced himself to think of ordinary things, hunger, infection, recovery. But the moment he held his stethoscope to a child's chest, he heard something he couldn't explain, a faint whisper under the heartbeat, counting, 1, 2, 3, schneiden, cut. He nearly dropped the instrument. The mother thought he was ill. Maybe he was. That evening, he found himself standing at the river without remembering how he got there. The current was shallow and sluggish, the surface covered in a faint sheen that caught the dying light like glass. On the far bank stood the old house, its windows dark. And yet he could see movement inside, a flicker of shadow pacing behind the curtains, slow and deliberate. When he returned home, he found his medical bag open on the floor. Inside lay a small drawing, folded carefully. He unfolded it with shaking hands. It showed 3 figures standing over a table. One of them, taller, wearing a doctor's coat, held a knife. The caption, written in a child's hand, read, "The doctor helps when he sleeps." Weiss burned the paper immediately. The flame was small but furious, curling the edges into black lace. He stood watching it until it was gone, until the smoke filled his lungs. He tried to convince himself it was a prank, that the children had followed him home, that trauma made them clever, manipulative. But a part of him, the part that still smelled the cellar in his dreams, whispered otherwise. When he finally slept again, he dreamt of a classroom. The blackboard was covered in medical diagrams, lungs, hearts, veins, all drawn in white chalk by small hands. The children sat quietly in the front row, wearing aprons, and Anna's voice came from the dark. "We learned from you, Doctor. You taught us how to open things, to see what's wrong inside." He woke to the sound of humming. And this time, it wasn't coming from outside his window. Dr. Weiss went to the church that evening, not because he believed, but because it was the only place that still smelled like the world before. The faint incense, the wax, the cold stone. All of it felt sterile, controllable, clean. Father Roth was old and nearly blind, but his hearing was sharp and his silence sharper. He'd been in Grunwald since before the war and had buried enough people to know when a man came not for forgiveness, but to be witnessed. Weiss sat in the confessional without speaking at first. The wood creaked as he shifted, hands clasped too tightly. The priest waited, patient, letting the quiet stretch until it cracked on its own. "I've done something wrong," Weiss finally said, "or maybe I'm only remembering it wrong." Roth's voice was soft, cracked with age. "Then tell me what you remember." "There are children," Weiss said. "They're different. They don't play, they don't cry, they know things they shouldn't." He swallowed. "I think someone taught them." "That doesn't sound like sin," Roth murmured. "It is," Weiss said quickly, "because I think it was me." The priest didn't answer right away. "You believe you harmed them?" "I don't know," Weiss whispered. "I keep dreaming of a cellar, of lessons I don't remember giving. I see my hands moving, cutting, showing them where to look, how to—" He stopped, voice shaking. "I thought it was mercy then. The war made us all believe that." The priest exhaled slowly. "Mercy without God is only method." Weiss laughed weakly. "Then I'm full of methods." There was another long silence. Somewhere outside, a bell rang once. "Doctor," Roth said finally, "you can't confess what the world ordered you to do. You can only choose whether you keep doing it." Weiss's throat tightened. "And if it never stopped? If what I did then is still happening now?" Roth's voice lowered. "Then you've mistaken endurance for repentance." Weiss looked down at his trembling hands. "They've built something in that house, something like memory, but alive. They say I taught them. They say their father was me. Do you believe them?" He hesitated. "I'm starting to." The priest's voice grew distant. "The sins of the fathers grow roots, Conrad. They don't die. They learn." Weiss felt something heavy press against his chest. Guilt, dread, recognition. He stood abruptly, the confessional shaking. "I can't stop them," he said. "Then pray," Roth answered. "Not for forgiveness, for containment." Weiss left without another word. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold. Across the road, he thought he saw 3 figures standing by the church gate, small, still, watching. He blinked, and they were gone. Back inside the booth, Father Roth crossed himself. But when he opened the partition to give the final blessing, he found the other side empty, and 3 small fingerprints pressed into the wood. The next morning, Dr. Weiss awoke with a decision heavy in his chest. It wasn't courage, it was resignation. He knew he couldn't go on pretending the children were just damaged by war. There was something deliberate in them, something constructed. And if he didn't face it now, he knew it would grow past him. He waited until evening, when the mist came down from the hills and the roads emptied. The villagers stayed indoors once the bells stopped ringing. Only the desperate or the damned walked after dark, and Weiss wasn't sure which he was anymore. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark but alive with silence, the kind that listens back. He knocked once. No answer. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, that faint sweetness again, undercut by something damp and chemical. It was the same scent that haunted his dreams. The house was immaculate as always, but there was a wrongness to the order now. Chairs turned just slightly toward the cellar door, as if the room had been waiting. He stepped closer. The nails were gone. The door stood ajar, blackness spilling from its seams like breath. Weiss lifted his lantern and began to descend. The steps creaked under his weight, the walls slick with condensation. At the bottom, the air was thick and wet. He could hear the faint hum of flies, though he couldn't see them. The light found the table again, the same one he'd seen before, only now it wasn't empty. Glass jars lined the shelves along the wall, each labelled in a child's neat hand. Tongue, heart, eye, rat, goat. Some jars held only murky fluid, others contained shapes, small, grey, floating, folded in on themselves. He tried not to retch. On the far wall, drawings covered the wood. Not childish sketches, diagrams, perfectly detailed renderings of veins, muscle groups, and incisions. Each one labelled in German and Latin. One was signed AEL in the corner. Weiss's stomach turned cold. Those were his initials too. Anna's voice came from the shadows behind him. "You see now." He spun around. She stood at the foot of the stairs, Emil beside her, both calm as if this were a tour of a classroom. "Where did you learn this?" Weiss demanded. His voice broke, echoing off the walls. Anna smiled faintly. "We told you. You taught us. We just kept going." Emil picked up a jar and held it toward him, reverently. Inside was something small, pale, human. Weiss backed away, shaking his head. This isn't learning. It's desecration." Anna tilted her head. "Then why did you write it down first?" He stared at her, not understanding. She pointed to the shelf above the table. Weiss followed her gaze and saw it, an old leather notebook, warped with damp, its cover stamped faintly with the insignia of the Reich's Medical Corps. His name embossed on the bottom corner, Dr. Konrad Weiss. Weiss reached for the notebook with hands that no longer felt like his own. The leather was cracked, swollen with moisture, but the pages inside were intact, thin, yellowed, and written in a script he recognized immediately, his own, precise, formal, and detached. He'd written these lines years ago, in another world. Test subject age, 6 years, response to chloroform controlled, cardiac rhythm irregular after incision, subject expired 22/16, emotional response none. He read further, each entry worse than the last, lists of children, coded initials, experiments disguised as compassion. At the bottom of one page, in darker ink, a note that seemed newer. Continuing trials through secondary participants. Success likely through imitation. His throat tightened. "This isn't real," he whispered. But the paper smelled faintly of the same chemical sweetness that lingered in the cellar. Anna stepped closer. "It's your handwriting," she said softly. "He said you'd deny it at first." "Who?" Weiss rasped. "Our father," she answered, "the one who taught us that mercy is precision." Emil set the jar down carefully and pulled back the linen sheet from the table. Beneath it lay something small and pale, a baby goat, or what had once been one. Its chest had been opened neatly, its ribs pinned apart with nails, its organs arranged beside it like a lesson. "We practiced," Emil said calmly. "He said we should learn on things that didn't scream like people." Weiss staggered back, bile rising in his throat. "Why are you showing me this?" Anna looked at him, unblinking. "Because you stopped. And he said stopping is worse than killing." "I never taught you this," he shouted. The sound broke against the walls, hollow and weak. Anna tilted her head, studying him the way her brother did, curious, not cruel. "You did," she said. "Maybe not with your hands, but you showed the others, the ones who watched you cut without shaking. They wrote it all down. We read every word." Weiss turned toward the stairs, desperate for air, but Emil's voice stopped him. "Do you want to see the living one?" Weiss froze. What? Emil gestured toward the corner of the room. A small cot sat in the shadows, draped with a thin blanket. Something under it moved, slow and shallow. Weiss's lantern flickered as he stepped closer. The blanket slipped aside. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. Thin, silent, breathing weakly, but alive. Tiny stitches crossed its chest in neat rows, the work of careful, practiced hands. Weiss's mind fractured in silence. The hum of Lena's lullaby drifted down the stairs, slow and rhythmic. Anna's voice followed, calm and clear. You told him he was your patient. You said you'd make him better. Weiss fell to his knees. Dear God, what have I done? Anna knelt beside him, her tone almost tender. What we were taught, Doctor, she smiled. We only finished your work. Dr. Weiss staggered out of the cellar like a man surfacing from a grave. The house was utterly silent now, the kind of silence that hums in the skull after a scream. He dropped the notebook onto the table upstairs, the leather slick with sweat, the smell of it clinging to his skin. He wanted to believe it was a forgery. It had to be. A cruel joke, a trick of handwriting, the delusion of a mind cracking under guilt. He'd seen soldiers confess to crimes they hadn't done just to make the silence stop. Maybe he was no different. But the details, the measurements, the names, the dates, they were too exact. He had been there. Leipzig, 1943. The experiments under clinical supervision. He remembered the faces, the crying, the shaking of his own hands. He remembered promising himself he was just an observer. And now, standing in that house with those children, his own methods staring back at him, he realized observation had never been neutral. It had been inheritance. He poured himself a glass of brandy from the kitchen cabinet. His hands shook so violently that half of it spilled. He drank the rest in one gulp and sat in the dark until his heartbeat slowed. By dawn, he had made his choice. He burned the diary. The flames caught fast, curling the pages inward, the ink blistering into black bubbles. He stood over it until it turned to ash, until the smell of burning paper replaced the sweet rot that had filled his nose for days. It ends here, he said aloud, as if saying it made it true. But it didn't. That afternoon, he went to the clinic, forcing himself to work, checking fevers, setting a broken wrist, prescribing antibiotics. Normal things, human things. But even as he moved through those motions, he could feel their eyes on him. The children, the villagers, the dead. When he returned home, he found a note under his door. It was written in Anna's handwriting. You forgot the other book. His stomach sank. He tore through his shelves, his drawers, his desk, everything where a record might hide. Nothing. Then, under the floorboard near his bed, he found a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside was a single notebook, not his, but a child's. The first page began with a drawing of a man in a white coat. The face was his. Below it, the words, Father said to forgive him when he remembers. Weiss sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the note trembling in his hands. He didn't go back to the house again that week. He told himself the cellar would stay closed, the children would forget, and he would heal. But healing, he realized, is only for the innocent, and innocence had long since rotted out of him. It was mid-July when the baby vanished. The child belonged to Frau Meinhardt, a young widow who lived 2 houses away from the Reiners. She'd survived the bombing of Dresden, only to find herself back in the ruins of another life, a small room, a crying infant, and a hunger that never quite left her bones. That morning she had left the child sleeping in its cradle while she went to fetch water. When she returned, the window was open, the blanket gone, and the cradle empty. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just a faint smell of iron in the air. And one thing she couldn't explain. The floorboards beneath the cradle were wiped clean, scrubbed, as if someone had been careful not to leave a trace. The villagers searched the river, the fields, the forest. They found nothing. The mayor blamed wolves again. The priest called for prayer. But in whispers the women said what no one wanted to say aloud, that it was the angel children. Dr. Weiss heard the news at the clinic. He felt the words like a physical blow. The missing child, the scrubbed floor, the smell of iron. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't, but every image in his mind pointed him back to the cellar. The small body on the cot, the precise stitches, the quiet humming that had followed him home. That evening, he sat in his office, staring at his medical bag. His fingers drummed against the leather, a nervous tick from his hospital days. He knew he had to go back, to end it, to make it right. But a part of him was terrified of what he might find, not in the house, but in himself. When he finally stood, it was dark. The streets were empty. The path to the river gleamed faintly under a waxing moon. He found the house as he had left it, silent, watchful. The cellar door closed once again. He called out, "Anna?" No answer. He called again, "Emile?" Something moved in the dark hallway. A small figure stepped into view. It was Lena. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy. She was holding something against her chest, wrapped tightly in cloth. Weiss's heart stopped. "Lena, what is that?" She smiled faintly. "You said to keep it warm." He took a step forward, his voice shaking. "Where did you get that?" "From the river," she whispered. It was floating. He reached for the bundle, but she stepped back. "Shh, you'll wake it." Weiss froze. The air in the house was too still, too thick. He could smell it again, that faint sweetness, that rot of milk and blood mixed together. And beneath it all, from somewhere deep below the floor, came a sound. Soft, wet, rhythmic. Something moving in the dark, something breathing. Dr. Weiss didn't remember drawing his pistol from his coat, though later he'd swear he hadn't meant to bring it. The sight of Lena standing there, her frail arms wrapped around that bundle, unlocked something primitive in him, a fear that came from before language. "Lena," he said softly, his hand trembling. "Give it to me." She tilted her head. "It's sleeping." Behind her, the floor creaked. Anna appeared in the doorway, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. She wasn't surprised to see him. She wasn't surprised by the gun. "You came back?" she said. "Yes," Weiss managed. "Where is it?" Anna's eyes flicked toward the cellar door. "You already know." "I want to hear you say it." She studied him for a long moment, then motioned to Lena. "Show him." Lena stepped forward and pulled the cloth aside. Inside was the baby, Frau Meinhardt's child. Its skin was pale, lips bluish, eyes half open but unfocused. It was breathing, faintly. On its chest, Weiss saw a single line of black stitches running straight down the sternum. He stumbled backward. "What have you done?" Anna's tone was steady. "We helped. You said a body can be repaired if it's opened carefully." "I never—" He stopped. He had. Years ago. Not to her, but to others, in cold rooms filled with clipboard men and children too small for the tables they lay on. He'd called it education, advancement. Emile emerged from the shadows, holding a lantern. Its flame danced over the cellar door, which now stood slightly ajar. From below came a faint buzzing, like flies or electricity. "You shouldn't have burned the book," Emile said quietly. She was angry. "She?" Weiss whispered. "Our mother," Anna replied. "The one you forgot." Weiss shook his head violently. "Your mother died in 1944. I never—" "You called her Subject 12, Anna interrupted, voice sharp now. "She remembered your hands, the way you looked away while they opened her. She said you trembled even then, but you didn't stop." The air left his lungs. The room tilted. Emile smiled, the same polite smile that had unsettled Weiss from the beginning. "She said you'd come back when you couldn't lie to yourself anymore." Weiss raised the gun. "You're sick," he said hoarsely. "All of you." Anna didn't move. "You can't shoot what you created, Doctor." Lena's humming began again, soft, circular, almost gentle. The sound filled the house, dulled the edges of reason. Weiss's grip faltered. "Go to the cellar," Anna said quietly. "It's waiting for you." He took one step back, then another, but the smell hit him, sharp, chemical, unmistakable. Chloroform. The lantern flickered. His vision blurred. Anna's voice was the last thing he heard before everything went white. "You said mercy is in the method. We're only finishing the lesson." Then nothing. Just the hum of the lamp and the sound of something wet moving below the floor. Weiss woke to darkness, thick and close, the kind that doesn't belong to night, but to walls. His wrists ached first, then his throat, then his chest, where something cold and wet pressed against his skin. He tried to move and felt resistance, straps, leather, the kind used in hospitals. For a moment he thought he was back in the war, another field tent, another operation gone wrong. Then the smell brought him back, that mix of rot, chloroform, and milk. "Don't move," a voice said softly. "Anna." She stepped into the lantern's glow, calm, composed, her grey dress spotless. In her hands was a basin of water, clear except for the faint red film floating on top. "What are you doing?" Weiss croaked. "You fainted," she said. "We're helping you wake." He tried to look around. He was on the cellar table. The jars had been moved aside, making space. Instruments, scalpels, needles, clamps, lay in perfect alignment beside him. His medical bag sat open on the shelf, every tool removed, cleaned, arranged. Emil stood near the stairs, holding the lantern. Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, humming that same lullaby. Weiss struggled against the straps, panic rising like bile. "Untie me. Now." Anna looked genuinely hurt. "You told us to be precise, to observe. We're only doing what you showed." "I never showed you this." Anna placed the basin on the table. "You did," she said quietly, "when you looked at the children and called it mercy." Weiss's breath hitched. "I was ordered. I didn't—" Emil interrupted. "You said that last time too." Anna picked up a scalpel. The blade caught the lantern light and flashed across her face. "We won't hurt you. We just want to understand how the teacher feels." Weiss's voice broke. "Please, Anna, you're not monsters. You're sick. I can help you." She smiled faintly. "You already did." Lena's humming grew louder, filling the air until Weiss's heartbeat matched its rhythm. He could feel his pulse pounding against the restraints, every thud a reminder of how alive he still was, and how much that could change. Anna leaned close, her voice soft, almost maternal. "He said we'd know we were ready when the patient begged for forgiveness before the incision." Tears slid down Weiss's temples. "Anna, whatever you think I did." But she was already moving, not clumsy or cruel, but careful, precise. A student performing a memorized task. She pressed the blade lightly to his collarbone, not deep, just enough to draw a single line of blood. Weiss screamed, not from the pain, but from the familiarity. He knew that cut. It was the first step of a procedure he'd once taught, the one they'd used to minimize shock. He realized then that this wasn't punishment. It was repetition, his own lesson, finally perfected. When he came to again, the straps were empty. The children were gone. The lantern lay on its side, still burning. The cellar smelled only of milk. And somewhere above him, the lullaby was still playing, faint, steady, and very far away. Dr. Weiss stumbled back to his quarters just before dawn, half blind and trembling. His shirt clung to him, stiff with dried blood, though the wound itself was shallow, a single line of red stitched closed with trembling hands. He didn't remember doing it. He shut the door and collapsed into the chair by his desk. The light of morning had no warmth. It only made the world more visible, more real. The cellar, the children, the voice that wasn't entirely Anna's. It all felt like a fever dream, but his skin told him otherwise. He reached for a cigarette and found his hands shaking too much to strike a match. When he finally managed, he took a long drag and opened his notebook. His handwriting looked steady enough, still the precise, clinical strokes of a doctor's report. He began writing because that's what he knew how to do when the world fell apart. Record, rationalize, reduce. Subject: Anna, Emil and Lena, presumed siblings, unverified lineage. Condition: mentally sound, behaviorally abnormal. Possible dissociative inheritance from wartime trauma. Recommendation: no medical intervention required. Case closed. He paused, the words blurring. He stared at them for a long time, then added one more line beneath. Personal note, unsubmitted. They finished what I began. He sat back. His lungs ached. His mouth tasted of ash. Weiss tore the page out, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope addressed to the Ministry of Health. Then he lit a second match, not for his cigarette this time, and touched it to the edge of the envelope. He watched the paper curl and blacken, just as the diary had. When it was ash, he whispered, "It ends here." But even as he said it, he heard a sound, faint, deliberate, at his window. 3 knocks, then silence. He rose, heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain. Nothing, just fog rolling off the river. He turned back to his desk and froze. On the chair across from him sat his medical bag. He didn't remember bringing it back from the house. It was open. Inside lay a single object wrapped in linen. Weiss unwrapped it slowly, dread blooming cold in his chest. It was his stethoscope, clean, polished. But someone had carved words into the tubing, careful and shallow. "We hear what you left behind." He dropped it and staggered back. The cigarette fell from his hand, burning a small black mark into the rug. He wanted to leave the village, to vanish into the cities, to forget. But there was nowhere left to go. That night, Weiss sat by the window, staring at the dark fields beyond the river. Somewhere out there, faint but unmistakable, came the echo of children's voices, counting, slowly, in perfect rhythm. Eins, zwei, drei, and then softly, as if reminding him of a promise, weiter, continue. The house burned on a Thursday night. No one saw the fire start, but several villagers later swore they'd heard singing beforehand, faint, rhythmic, like a nursery rhyme carried on the wind. By the time the first shouts went up, the flames had already reached the roof. The air reeked of kerosene and milk. Dr. Weiss was the first to arrive. He'd been unable to sleep, haunted by the sound of that counting in the distance. Eins, zwei, drei. Weiter. When he saw the smoke curling above the tree line, he ran without thinking, his coat half-buttoned, his heart thrashing in his throat. The front door was open. The inside glowed orange, shadows dancing across the walls like silhouettes of children at play. He shouted their names, Anna, Emil, Lena, but there was no answer, no movement except the slow collapse of beams overhead. He made it halfway up the stairs before the heat drove him back. The air burned his lungs. The floor above him gave a sharp, cracking sound, then caved in. The last thing he saw was the portrait above the mantel curling black from the edges, the photograph of the man and the 3 children, his own face smiling from the past, blistered, flaked, and disappeared in the flames. The villagers stood at a distance, watching the fire consume the house. None went closer. They didn't fetch water or tools. They only crossed themselves and muttered that it was God's will. By dawn, the building was nothing but a skeletal frame. No bodies were found, not even bones, only glass jars fused into puddles and the warped metal of surgical instruments twisted together like veins. Weiss searched through the ash until his fingers bled. He found nothing. When the mayor finally pulled him away, his eyes were raw and red. "They're gone," the mayor said quietly. "You did what you could." Weiss looked at the ruin, the smoke still rising in thin grey threads. "No," he said, "I didn't." He left Grunwald that morning, took the first train north and never looked back. He didn't resign from his post or file a report. He simply vanished, like the children, into the silence Germany had built around itself after the war. But even after he was gone, the stories lingered. The villagers said they heard tapping in the night from where the cellar had been, like something trying to count its way out. Others swore the river near the house turned cloudy whenever it rained, as if the ash refused to settle. The police declared the fire accidental, the church called it divine, and the children, officially, never existed. But one night, months later, a nurse in Munich claimed a man had come into the hospital, half-conscious, muttering a single phrase again and again. They finished the operation. When asked what he meant, he smiled faintly, the way a proud father might. Then he bit off his own tongue. The first letter arrived 3 months after Dr. Weiss disappeared. It came to his former office in Munich, unmarked except for his name typed neatly across the front. The secretary who opened it thought it was official correspondence and forwarded it to the sanatorium in Garmisch, where Weiss had been admitted under a false diagnosis of war neurosis. He received it one rainy morning while sitting on the veranda, staring at the mountains through the mist. He almost didn't open it. Most of his mail came from colleagues pretending he hadn't disgraced himself. But something about the paper stopped him. It was too clean, too deliberate. Inside was a single sheet. The handwriting was delicate, precise. "Dear Doctor, we're still practicing. We fixed the ribs this time. The heart beats slower, but it listens. We remember what you said. Control is mercy. You were right. Your pupils, AEL." Weiss dropped the page. His cigarette fell into his lap, burning a small hole through the hospital robe. The next letter came 2 weeks later. The same clean paper, the same initials. "The small ones breathe better when the cuts are shallow. We're learning to keep them alive longer. He said endurance is faith." He showed the letters to no one. He couldn't. If he told the staff, they'd think him delusional, a broken man haunted by ghosts of war. The third letter arrived with no stamp, just left on his breakfast tray. "You told us to finish what was started. We did. The lungs worked this time." That night, he tore open every vent in his room, searching for a hiding place, for eyes in the walls. But he found nothing, only dust and the faint smell of smoke. He tried to burn the letters, but the paper refused to catch. It browned, crumpled, but never turned to ash. The staff said Weiss began speaking to himself after that. At night, the nurses heard him whispering names, Anna, Emil, Lena, over and over, followed by the same quiet plea. "You're not real." But the fourth letter changed everything. "We're in the city now. The doctors here are kind. They like how we work. They say we have talent. Thank you for showing us how to care." Below it was a smudged hospital seal, Munich Children's Infirmary. Weiss's breath caught. He knew that hospital, one of the new research wings rebuilt after the war, staffed by men who'd never asked too many questions. He tried to warn them, sent telegrams, letters, anything. But no one listened. No one remembered him as a doctor anymore, only a patient. A week later, the infirmary caught fire. 3 patients were found dead. The rest were never recovered. The newspaper said it was electrical failure. Weiss knew better. The signature at the bottom of the last letter was different this time. "Your children." By the mid-1960s, Munich had reinvented itself. The rubble was gone, the shame was hidden, and new buildings gleamed where ashes once stood. The war was over, people said again, for real this time. Progress had replaced memory. At the edge of the city, a new children's hospital opened, the St. Adelheid Medical Ward. It was state-of-the-art, funded by the ministry, a symbol of post-war mercy. White walls, silver instruments, spotless rooms. A place, they said, where science could finally redeem itself. The head physician was Dr. Wilhelm Maurer, one of Weiss's former apprentices. His students called him methodical, brilliant, distant, traits that were more survival mechanisms than personality. He never spoke of his mentor, but a photograph on his desk showed a young Weiss standing beside a medical cot, smiling faintly. Within the first year, St. Adelheid earned acclaim for its experimental recovery programs. Children with severe deformities, war injuries, and trauma were admitted by the dozens. Some improved miraculously. Others vanished quietly from the records. When the nurses asked, they were told the patients had been transferred to secondary units. But no one ever saw those transfers. At night, the lower wing glowed with light, long after visiting hours. A faint humming, rhythmic, almost musical, drifted through the air vents. One nurse, Greta Voss, began keeping notes. She wrote of 3 young orderlies who appeared without introduction. No surnames, no paperwork. They worked only nights, always together, silent and precise. They cleaned the instruments, assisted in operations, and disappeared before sunrise. The staff called them the quiet ones. They were unnerving, not because they were cruel, but because they were perfect. They moved in sync, like dancers, never speaking except to one another. Greta swore one of them, the eldest, a girl with pale hair pinned back neatly, sometimes hummed while she worked. The melody was soft, circular, familiar in a way Greta couldn't place. Once, during a late-night shift, Greta entered the recovery room and froze. The orderlies were gathered around a small patient's bed, adjusting the sheets. The boy lay utterly still, chest rising faintly. His torso was bandaged from collarbone to stomach, the linen clean and white. The eldest orderly turned and smiled at Greta. "He'll be better now," she said, her voice calm, almost kind. Greta fled the room. The next day, the boy's file was gone. When she asked Dr. Maurer, he said simply, "There was no such patient." Greta resigned a week later. A month after her departure, a fire alarm triggered in the basement. Maintenance found one of the storage rooms locked from the inside. When they finally forced it open, the lights flickered on to reveal surgical beds covered with white sheets, empty but still warm. And on the wall above them, drawn in chalk, were 3 sets of initials. A.E.L. Greta Voss kept her silence for nearly 10 years. She left St. Adelheid Hospital in 1962 and never spoke of the night shift again, not to her family, not to her parish priest, not even to herself in prayer. But as the years passed, her sleep grew shorter, her hands colder. By 1971, living alone in a small flat near Augsburg, she decided confession wasn't enough. She began to write it all down. The statement was dated November 3rd, 1971, addressed "To whom it may concern," though she didn't seem to know who that was anymore. The letter began plainly, her handwriting neat and firm despite age. "I saw 3 of them that night. They were not doctors nor children. I'm not sure they were anything at all." Greta wrote that the incident occurred in March 1961, during her final month at St. Adelheid. A boy named Jonas Keller, age 9, had been admitted with lung infection. He'd survived bomb shelters as an infant, but the war had left his body fragile, lungs scarred like burnt paper. She was assigned to the night ward, her last duty before resignation. Around midnight, she noticed movement in the corridor. 3 figures in white coats, small and thin, walking in unison. She assumed they were medical interns. But as she stepped closer, she realized their coats were spotless, untouched by the daily grime of the ward. Their faces were pale, eyes dark, unblinking. The eldest, a girl, turned to her and smiled. "He's almost ready," she said. Greta froze. "Who?" "The boy." They entered Jonas's room. Greta followed, heart pounding. The boy was awake, staring at the ceiling, perfectly still. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate rhythm. The smallest of the 3, a girl with cropped hair, was humming softly, the same tune Greta had heard months earlier through the vents. The eldest brushed a hand across Jonas's forehead. "It's time," she said, her voice like prayer. Greta tried to intervene. "You can't operate without Dr. Maurer." The eldest turned. "He taught us already." And then, in one smooth motion, the middle one, a boy perhaps 10 or 11, drew a scalpel from the tray. The steel flashed once in the dim light. Greta screamed and lunged forward, but before she could reach them, the lights flickered and went out. When they came back on, the bed was empty. The sheets were wet, the pillow stained faintly red. The children were gone. She found Dr. Maurer later, pale and shaking. He told her there had never been a boy named Jonas Keller. "No file," he said. "No patient." "No." In her statement, Greta ended with a single line. "They weren't angels or devils. They were what we built when we refused to look at what we'd done." She mailed the statement to the Bavarian Ministry of Health. It was never acknowledged. A year later, Greta died in her sleep. When her landlord cleared her apartment, he found a sealed envelope under her bed. Inside was a photograph of 3 children in hospital whites. Their eyes were closed, but every one of them was smiling. In 1978, a freelance journalist named Karl Hoffner came across Greta Voss's unsent statement while researching a feature on post-war medical ethics. The paper had dismissed his story ideas before. Too bleak, his editor said. But the letter fascinated him. Its details matched whispers he'd heard for years, about doctors who vanished, records erased, experiments reborn under new flags. The address on the letter led him to an old sanatorium on the edge of Lake Garmisch. The building was nearly empty now, only a few patients, all elderly, all forgotten. Among them was Dr. Konrad Weiss. The staff told Hoffner the doctor barely spoke anymore. "His mind wanders," the head nurse warned. "He doesn't know what year it is." But when Hoffner mentioned the children, Weiss lifted his head for the first time in days. His eyes, clouded with age, sharpened instantly. Hoffner set his tape recorder on the table. The machine clicked, its reels spinning. "Hoffner, Dr. Weiss, I'm writing about the war's medical legacies, the experiments." Weiss, "Legacy," he said slowly. "That's what you call it now." Hoffner, "I read the nurse's account. She said there were children." Weiss, "There are always children." A pause, long enough for the faint hum of the sanatorium lights to fill the air. Hoffner, "She claimed they were yours." Weiss, "They belonged to no one. Not then, not now." Hoffner, "Do you remember their names?" Weiss, "Anna, Emil, Lena." Hoffner, "What happened to them?" Weiss, "They learned too well." His voice broke then, dry and thin as paper. The journalist offered him water, but Weiss waved it away. He began to speak without prompting, not in confession, not even in guilt, but in the dull rhythm of a man repeating something too often to still feel it. "We called it research. Healing. You can make anything sound clean if you name it right. They watched us, you know, always watched, eyes like mirrors. After the war, I thought the silence meant it was over. But silence is never an ending. It's breeding ground." He coughed, then leaned closer to the microphone. "They survived because we built the world for them. We taught them method. We taught them control. What else could they become?" The tape clicked faintly. Hoffner asked, "Do you think they're still alive?" Weiss smiled then, a dry, papery curve of the lips. "Alive?" he repeated. "No, worse than that. They're employed." The nurse entered a few minutes later to take him to supper. Weiss didn't resist. As he rose, he said quietly, "You'll hear them too when you play it back. You always do." Hoffner rewound the tape that night in his hotel room. The first few minutes were clear, the hum of conversation, Weiss's rasping voice. But near the end, beneath the final question, another sound crept in. Soft, steady, children humming. The tape was later found in Hoffner's typewriter case after he failed to return from a train trip to Munich. The case was empty. The tape reels were still turning. The tape never made it to print. Karl Hoffner's editor dismissed his story as madness stitched to myth. The reel was confiscated, the article buried. His disappearance was treated as a nervous breakdown. The hospital denied any interview had ever taken place, but pieces of it survived, copied, whispered, retold in classrooms, psychology papers, medical ethics debates, always under different names, always a few details missing. The kind of story that refuses to die but never truly lives. The name Dr. Konrad Weiss faded quietly into footnotes. He was buried under a false date, in an unmarked grave on hospital grounds. The sanatorium burned 2 years later. They called it faulty wiring. By then, St. Adelheid Hospital had already reopened under a new name, a new foundation. New doctors, new faces, new children. History does not bury its monsters. It promotes them. In 1985, a nursing student cleaning the hospital archives found a locked cabinet labeled Pediatric Research Division, 1949-1961. Inside were files with no cover sheets, only patient initials, and notes written in different hands. At the back of the drawer, she found a single envelope marked Confidential for continuation. Inside was a letter, dated decades earlier. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably Weiss's. "If they come to you, do not look for evil. You will not find it. Look for structure, look for repetition. They do not kill out of cruelty, but out of imitation. That is what makes them human. The student turned the paper over. On the back, 3 sets of initials had been written in ink that never faded. AEL. After that, reports began again, faint at first, easy to dismiss. A child in Berlin found dissecting frogs with surgical precision. A teenage boy in Hamburg caught keeping a classmate's tooth collection in labelled jars. 3 foster siblings in Frankfurt who never spoke at all but smiled when someone cried. Each time the case went nowhere, each time the record disappeared, and each time someone somewhere would whisper the same words almost reverently. The quiet ones. No one can say for certain if Anna, Emil and Lena lived beyond that fire, but something did, an inheritance, not of blood but of behavior. The quiet patience of those who learned in rooms where morality rotted and obedience was called mercy. And maybe that's the true horror. Not that the children survived, but that they grew up, and the world was ready for them. Because the war didn't end in 1945. It just changed its uniform. They say evil fades with time, that memory heals, that silence is peace. But silence isn't peace. It's the sound of something being passed down, quietly, efficiently, from one steady hand to another. Dr. Weiss thought he'd destroyed the lessons he taught, but lessons don't burn, they replicate. They move into new rooms, new uniforms, new generations who don't ask why, only how. Maybe the children didn't survive that fire. Maybe they just grew up into people who know how to smile while they cut. People who call cruelty a cure and procedure compassion. People who look normal until the light hits them the wrong way. And maybe they never stopped humming. Maybe they're still out there, behind glass, under masks, wearing the title doctor, learning, teaching, continuing. Because what we call horror, they call inheritance. If this story unsettled you, if you heard that faint humming while you listened, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record. Every day we exhume another truth history tried to sterilize. The quiet kind of evil, the kind that doesn't hide in monsters but in people who learned too well. Because the most terrifying thing about horror is how human it always is.